So, what makes up an intentional tort? A civil wrong resulting from the intentional act of the wrongdoer. This person is known as a tortfeasor, one who commits a tort. That could also go for unintentional. And then tortious behavior, an act of conduct that constitutes a tort. And then intent is the key difference here. That's why the word's different. The desire to bring about certain results. Okay, so there is intention in what's going on. Negligence is just not paying attention or maybe doing something and not really thinking about your actions. We talked about that omission versus commission. It could be you choosing not to do something that it would have made sense for you to do, like putting a sign out with that slick area, or that doctor, they need to take action and do CPR, but choosing not to. So sometimes it's choosing not to do something, sometimes it's choosing to do something. For intentional, you're always choosing to do something. So first one, assault and aggravated assault. So this is not the actual violence, okay? So sometimes you hear assault and battery or, oh, that's assault. Assault is not necessarily the physical contact. So not the actual violence, but rather the attempt or threat of violence. So if it does not require actual touching. All right, so there may not be an actual wound of any form. So 3 elements of assault. Intent to cause apprehension, okay? So placing that fear on someone. Apprehension of imminent harm. So it's usually assault and battery because you're scared of the battery. So there's that apprehension of imminent harm and then a lack of consent. And when you think about, this could also go into sexual assault. Is that lack of consent, the intent or the apprehension involved in sexual assault. So obviously we won't cover that a ton in this course, we'll mention it, but I want you to remember that assault is that fear involved. So the apprehension, the intent to make them fearful, the apprehension of causing an apprehension of imminent harm, and then a lack of consent involved also. Is important. And then aggravated assault, criminal laws punish more severely due to the seriousness. So this is another level. So maybe a weapon, the status of the victim, so maybe like a child or something like that. And then intent of the perpetrator, and then the degree of injury involved after, whether that's mental or later physical. And so next we'll go into battery. But I want you to keep in mind that assault doesn't have to be physical. Okay, now sometimes it will go hand in hand with battery. Most of the time it does. But that apprehension, I really want you to think assault, apprehension, it's a lot of times the fear of what's to come or the potential harm, the potential danger. So then we jump to battery and criminal battery. So this is the unlawful physical contact often followed by assault. So battery is the actual, there is contact, whether with a weapon, hands, etc. Civil battery, intent, contact, and then there's damages. So damages are awarded depending on the seriousness. And then criminal battery, that's taking it to another level. So this is one of those that maybe with civil battery, there was a bar fight. Always a great example, right? The person would maybe have to cover medical expenses, things like that. But both people were at fault. So one person's probably not going to jail for something like that. I don't know. I'm not around bar fights a lot. Probably not the best example. But criminal battery, this is taking it to the next level. So mens rea, term to know, will be on the test. Criminal intent to do wrong, to cause harmful or offensive conduct. Because sometimes, like I mentioned, a bar fight, someone is drunk, intoxicated, something like that. They weren't intending to cause the harm they did. Obviously, they did the actions of battery, but there may not have been the intent or the same level of intent. With criminal battery, there's definitely intent, for sure. There's planning, there's multiple things that have happened, whereas the civil battery may be a more flippant scenario, let's say. So intentional proof that the perpetrator intended to cause harm. So they go into a situation planning to take a knife into a certain situation and take any form of a weapon. So intentional and then unintentional. So sometimes you can have unintentional criminal battery, once again, to the extent. Obviously there are millions of examples, millions of scenarios. It's hard to sometimes tell where the lines fall. That's why I'm glad that I don't have to do this for an actual living. Unintentional proof that the person's misconduct viewed objectively was so reckless as to constitute a gross departure from the standard of conduct of a law-abiding person would observe, okay? but such an extreme scenario, so there may not be intent, but it's just absolutely reckless, that it's criminal battery. Okay, so those are some scenarios that hopefully that helps you know a little more about assault and battery, terms that you hear regularly. There's a little more detail on it. Okay, the next one we have, I've mentioned earlier that, you know, that emotions and the mental side of things are something that you could also press charges for. So it's not just physical injury, physical damages, financial damages. The emotional side could also be a factor. So defamation, the act of harming the reputation of another by making a false statement, written or oral, to a third person. If the alleged defamation involves a matter of public concern, the plaintiff is constitutionally required to prove both the statement's falsity and the defendant's fault. Okay, so that last line is referencing, so if somebody says something bad about a person and it's true, that's not defamation. Okay, it may not be nice to repeat, but that's not defamation if it actually occurred. So if there's this public information getting out, but it actually happened, then you can't be in trouble for that. But putting out false information to the public, definitely defamation. And there also has to be an exchange with a third party. So it has to be basically said about someone. Defamation is not protected by the First Amendment. Okay, so I've got freedom of speech, hate speech, defamation, libel, slander, which we'll talk about in a second, not protected by the First Amendment. Okay, so when the white supremacists want to go out and have hateful signs bashing in a public space, that is not allowed. Okay, so police officers, rightfully so, go in and prevent something like that. Now, sorry to use the white supremacist example, white supremacists or any other form of rioting body are allowed to go out and say what they want until there's direct hate speech involved, which usually happens pretty quickly in the white supremacy option. Not a good one. So you're not allowed to go and, yes, you can go and say what you want to say, but your freedom to say what you want to say stops when it is negative towards another party. So a lot of riots like that are cut off. A lot of times they're planned and eliminated. Obviously, with abortion, there's been a lot of things that you're allowed to take a sign out. So this, law just passed in New York. You're allowed to take a sign out and say pro-abortion, pro-life, whatever. But when it gets to a line where you defame someone, maybe you're pro-life and you defame someone that has had an abortion, that's not okay. You're allowed to say, yay abortion, yay life, but when it turns into blasting on the other party, that's where it's cut off, and that's where defamation comes in. So then we have another issue with public figures and public officials, celebrities, things like that. When we get into privacy rights, and I think I've got a slide talking about the private versus public issues here in a second. But there's two types of defamation. We have slander, which is spoken, which may be something that's chanted at a riot. And then libel is the written word, okay? So it's actually printed maybe in a newspaper, maybe on one of those signs at a, pro-abortion something. And then public officials and public figures waive their right to privacy, okay? So there's also a factor involved that if you are, say, the President of the United States, by having that level of authority, benefit, title, prominence, fame, you put yourself in a scenario where people are allowed to say bad things about you, basically. And so it is, for me, who's not very important, if somebody wants to go publish in the newspaper all these things about how terrible of a person I am, that's not okay. That's defamation. That is libel. But people are allowed to do that with public figures. If you see those kind of raunchy, for like my mom uses that word, raunchy magazines about celebrities and stuff like that, always making up rumors and lies about what these celebrities are doing. That's a form of libel, But because of the benefits of being a public figure, you kind of lose that privacy that people basically get to say what they want to about you. We see that a lot, all LeBron haters, things like that. It's pretty common. So there's a little info on that. I honestly don't remember what this link is, but you can check it out. And then often causes a person to lose their right to a defamation case. So basically, if LeBron wants to complain about all the people bashing him on social media, basically they're going to say, well, you get this, this, and this because you're famous, and therefore you lose people get to say what they want, right or wrong. You lose some of that right to privacy for them to talk about you. Now, once again, somebody could not go post and talk about, make up a lie about LeBron. But a good example is the Kobe situation, okay? So when Kobe had his affair, there was all the sexual misconduct. People were allowed to say information and details about his life, whereas Joe Schmo, who does the same thing and isn't a public figure, that's not going to be put out to the public. But because Kobe was a public figure, it's allowed to be put out there. Like I said, you can't make up lies about them. You can't produce false information, but you are allowed to pretty openly talk about bad or wrong things they do. It's just kind of how it is. So it's a trade. And so for general society, we have more rights to privacy, that our information won't be released. But you kind of give up some of those things as a public figure. So I mentioned some of this stuff already. There's 4 categories of privacy rights. These cases are really interesting. Please read these in the book. But there's 4 categories of privacy rights. So the use of a person's name, picture, or other likeness for commercial purposes without permission. So this is one of those, getting into those specific rights. Intrusion of an individual's affairs or seclusion. All right, so it's not right to go into some famous person's backyard and be taking pictures of them. That's not cool. That's an invasion of privacy. That is not a right that they give up because they're famous. Publication of information that places a person in a false light. That's what I was talking about earlier. You can't go just publicizing false information about LeBron. That's not acceptable. And then public disclosure or private facts about an individual that an ordinary person would find objectionable. So just things that somebody shouldn't have to, their personal life that shouldn't be out in public just because they're famous. It can't just be thrown around. Even though sometimes it does, and it does make it really difficult for them to win a case in that regard. So these lines are not super clear. In case you haven't figured that out. And it's also hard to tell what and who are public figures, because in some places, a high school football coach would never be viewed as a public figure, but in a lot of places, a high school football coach would be. So you have issues like that. Like, yeah, we can start with LeBron, but what about maybe a college president? Are they a public figure? Kinda. So a lot of times with these cases, the main issue is not the information being shared, but really the question of, is this person a public figure? You have to figure that out before you can figure out, is this defamation? Is this a violation of privacy? Okay, so we have defamation and privacy rights. Those are 2 separate intentional torts that are involved, but a lot of times they do cross over. So these are really interesting cases. So I'll talk about this one. So this O'Brien versus Pabst Sells Co. So just think beer there. So they had put this athlete, O'Brien, his image on a beer can to sell it. So this was like before endorsement contracts were a thing. So they put his face on this beer can, and he was like, whoa. And it wasn't even for him, hey, I'm not making money off this, but for him it was, I don't support that as an athlete. I don't drink beer, and I don't want people putting me in that category. So he's like, that's not cool. And then this GM was a commercial that they used Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and he was mad because he wasn't making money and he didn't support the way that they represented him in that commercial. All right, so companies cannot just use athletes' images. I think most of you all are aware of that. But read the book, learn a little more detail about that. But a lot of times you may see commercials that are selling a product that they want it to be related to sports, but they don't want to pay for a proper endorsement. So I've seen one that they tried to make this football player look like Cam Newton. And so they had him in a Panthers uniform. They had all the colors of the Panthers. And obviously it was an African American throwing a football. And so that was his likeness. Like, it's very clearly, okay, you're trying to make this Cam Newton. But there's a certain number of things that you can do. Okay, they just used the colors. They didn't actually use Cam Newton. They didn't have any Under Armour involved because that's who he is endorsed by. So they took away enough things that it's like, okay, this isn't straight up Cam Newton. It's not 100% clear that it's Cam Newton. It can be assumed that. So that's a way that a lot of times companies kind of play those lines of privacy issues. But then you think of maybe the Brita commercials with Steph Curry. Like, obviously, he's being paid to do that. He's there. He's not in his Under Armour uniform. He's not in his official Golden State Warriors uniform, because then they would have to pay the Golden State Warriors, the NBA, Under Armour, all those things. But he's just in like a royal blue jersey, maybe some white shorts, and he's representing Brita. And he's being paid to use his likeness. So those are some examples of the privacy and publicity rights. It's all pretty complicated, but these are some really entertaining cases, so read those. All right, so another one, sexual harassment. Okay, this is always an issue, so I'm saying this, and I'm hoping you all are watching this. This isn't referencing rape. Sexual harassment and rape are not the same thing, so do not write the word rape on your test. Okay, don't type it, don't reference it, don't use it in an essay. That's not what we're talking about. That's a different issue, much larger issue, not what we're talking about. Sorry for the lecture, but other classes have had issues with that in the past, so I just want to clarify, okay? So, we have two types of sexual harassment in here. Also notice that this is not sexual assault either. That's a different category. So we haven't even made it that far. So we're still in the intentional tort zone. Sexual harassment is the next one we're talking about. So we have two types. You will be asked this on your exam. Two types. Quid pro quo, hostile environment. Quid pro quo, think exchange. So this is a scenario, usually there is an exchange of sexual favors from a lower employee who's trying to move up or get more benefits. So it's usually boss and inferior employee, and boss says, hey, I'll pay you if you do this for me. I'll make sure you get a promotion if you do this for me. So there's an exchange. So they say, I will do this sexual act in exchange for compensation, title, promotion. So there is an exchange. Hostile environment is may not be a person involved in the sexual, like directly in the exchange or comments or whatever. So this is when an unwelcome sexual conduct unreasonably interferes with an individual's job performance or creates a hostile, intimidating, or offensive work environment. So this could be a coworker making comments at another coworker, okay? And obviously that makes it difficult for that person to work because their peer is constantly making these comments towards them, and it's a difficult work environment because they know every time they walk by, somebody's going to make a comment. But it could also be a situation where there are two consenting individuals maybe making comments, and it makes it uncomfortable for a third party. So that third party could also have a situation of hostile environment, even though they're not directly involved, but because of the exchange that they're hearing and kind of involved in, it makes their work environment hostile and uncomfortable and unpleasant and difficult to do their job. So those are the two. That's not sexual assault. That's definitely not rape. Okay, those are two forms of sexual harassment. Please know the difference. Feel free to do further research. And so then here are just some 4 elements of what a hostile work environment looks like. You can check those out. And then hazing. This is one. Coaches, especially of boys, like it's just a thing. And for some reason, hazing is acceptable. A fun game that I usually play when this class actually meets is students will tell stories that they know of hazing. And it's interesting all the crazy things that can happen. And the reason I do that is not to make fun or joke about it or shed light on it, but to realize how prominent it is. And hazing is absolutely a thing. Even through the college level, it does appear, and it's also not just in sports. There are situations with bands, with choral groups, things like that. Hazing's a thing, obviously sororities and fraternities. There's a few cases in the book about this, but as coaches, as administrators, please, please, please supervise your athletes and prevent these things from happening. If you have middle schoolers in a locker room, I know it seems like it might be kind of weird that you're in there, but you need to be checking in. Players should always know that at any point in time coach could come in. Obviously, if you coach female athletes and you're a male or vice versa, you don't need to be walking in there because then we have a whole different issue. But you need to have a coach of the same sex, of those athletes that are changing, and they need to go in and out. When I was a high school coach, I didn't say hang out in the locker room before games and things like that, but I made sure to make rounds very regularly, and they knew that at any point I could be coming in there. And so you want to have that in your athlete's brain that, hey, coach could come in at any time. Administrators, that's not usually your specific role. It's more coaches, but administrators, you need to make sure your coaches are doing that, because all the time there are situations where athletes are being hazed and sometimes worse in locker rooms. So you really, please, those of you who are going into coaching, please be aware of this. Middle school, high school, college, whatever. Sadly, maybe even younger than that, especially if there's older kids and younger kids in the same environment. Please, please, please be aware and supervise to prevent these situations, okay? So those are our different forms of intentional tort. We had sexual harassment, we had assault, battery, all that jazz. So these, on that essay, you could use hazing and you could use battery as two of your examples for your essay that you would need to find cases for. But read some of these cases. There's some crazy stuff that's happened. But there's the rundown on intentional tort.